Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, downloading, and subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I'm 12 Kyle. Check this out. On this podcast, we're actually going to talk about how to make a podcast. What got me to thinking about doing this was I've been asked quite a few times over the past few months, and it's a question that I get asked often. How do you start a podcast? And when I get asked that question, I'm always interested and always willing to, give my 12 cents as to how you actually get started. Honestly, it's not very hard to do. I have been doing this podcast at the time of this recording. I'm coming up on 4 years. It doesn't feel like that, but I'm coming up on 4 years. And prior to doing this podcast for 4 years, I had an internet radio show called the 12 Radio Show. And I had that for 5 years. So I've been doing this type of thing for almost 10 years now, which is bugged out because it really doesn't feel like it's been that long. But I think there's a couple of things that you want to do when it comes to starting a podcast. The first thing that you want to do is answer this question. Why am I making a podcast? Why do I want to do a podcast? And the reason being is that some people get into podcasting for different reasons. Some people get into it because they think it's fun or they think that it will be fun. Others get into it because they see it as an avenue to, spark change. Others see it as an avenue where they can potentially make some money. And to be honest, you can do all three. But I think that question is important because you want to make sure that you're doing it for a specific reason or specific reasons. That way, when you get frustrated, you can always remind yourself, well, this is why I'm doing it. And I've seen, more than a few podcasts start off really, really strong and then kind of fade away because they were, I guess for a lack of a better terms, they weren't getting the listens that they thought that they should be getting, and they became frustrated with it. And that's understandable. But I think what happens is that if you get into it thinking that, okay, well, I'm going to get, 50,000 people to listen, 50,000 people aren't going to listen to your first 10 podcasts. I'm just going to, unless you're a celebrity or someone who has an already well-established platform, it's probably not going to happen. For Joe Schmo like me and you, probably not going to happen. But I've seen people get frustrated and leave the game really because they just weren't getting the results. I get it, but I think sometimes you have to ask yourself, why are you doing it? And I think if you have a specific reason or reasons as to why you're doing it, it makes it that much easier. For me, like I said, I had a radio show and I transitioned that into the podcast. And this has always just been fun. It's been a labor of love. So it's not like it's something that, I'm not using this podcast to feed my wife and kids. So there's that element of it. But, would I want to have the platform and the podcast on a major level or something like that? Like if it was on TV or something, of course that'd be dope, but it's not something that I'm, holding my breath on. Another question you have to ask yourself as well, who is your audience? That can be a difficult question to answer because your audience may or may not change. If you use different sites, they will give you, and I'll give you Spotify, for example. Spotify will give you some data and some information as to the demographics of your listeners. So you can find out if it's male, female. They also give you their age range as far as the demographics are concerned. So you have a little bit of information to go off of. And then there are other sites like SoundCloud, which will actually tell you where people are listening to your podcast at. So like for me, for example, I didn't know that people in Australia listen to my podcast. I don't know anybody in Australia. I've never been to Australia, but according to SoundCloud, I'm pretty popular over there. And what I mean by popular is there's like 30 people that listen in Australia, and they listen on a consistent basis. And again, I don't know who in Australia is listening to this podcast, but if you're listening in Australia, shout out to you. What's up? What's good? Hit me up. Hit me up and say what's up. But yeah, so I don't know. I know the basic demographics of the people that listen to this podcast, but for the most part, I don't know who all's listening. And I think really to some degree, there's a beauty in the podcasting, because when you create something and you put it out for the consumption of everyone, you have no idea who's going to listen. So you want your podcast to just be dope. And I think for me, just on a personal note, that's always been my goal, just to create dope shit. And at the end of the day, that's all that I really, really care about. I've never put out a podcast that I didn't feel wasn't dope. Now, I will say I have recorded some that I didn't think was dope, and I never released them. That happens, not often, but it's happened to me from time to time. And it's just a personal thing. I'm kind of anal about stuff like that. But always constantly ask yourself, who's your audience? And then, you want to make sure that you're kind of catering to your audience. Personally, I think I cater to my audience, but I never go into recording a podcast saying, okay, well, this one's going to have this many hits because this is, this topic. I know, generally speaking, if I'm talking about music, that's going to have a certain number of listens. If I'm talking about relationships, that's going to have a certain number of listens. But I don't really, at least just on a personal note, I don't record for that. I do these because of this is whatever I want to talk about when I sit down in my house and record. That's it. I just try to keep it simple. But some people have, target topics that they want to talk about, and and it works for them. Speaking of, that's another thing that's very important. What are going to be your topics? I think that's a very important question to ask that we all have to answer. What are you going to talk about, and with whom will you talk about it? That's big, because your subject matter is going to vary, obviously, from week to week. On this podcast, as you can tell, I talk about everything. I will literally be in traffic and I'll jot something down or send a note to myself or email to myself and say, hey, you can talk about this topic. Or I'll read something online and I'll send myself an email saying, okay, well, hey, I can talk about this topic. It's just stuff, whatever I want to talk about. So I don't have a particular, so I'm all over the place. So honestly, one week you might hear me talking about hip hop, and the next week you might hear me talking about dating. And, the person that listens to me talk about hip hop may not want to hear me talk about dating. So they may or may not tune into that, or vice versa. So it just depends. But a lot of podcasts have the format of where they talk about current events. Personally, it doesn't work for me, because I'm going to be honest, I really don't care about current events. I care, but I don't care to talk about them. And the reason being is that, like, if I'm listening to, let's say, my 3 favorite podcasts, are talking about current events. By the time I listen to them, and then I listen to some of the bigger podcasts, talk about current events, I ain't got shit to say after that. I'm pretty much tapped out. So I just on and for me, in doing podcasts the way that I do them, none of my material is dated. Like I said, the podcast is almost 4 years old. So if I'm talking about my personal experiences and things that I've done growing up, or if I'm talking about a college story, or if I'm talking about my perspective on a music piece of work, it's not dated. So you can always go back and listen. It's not like, I was talking about the presidential election last week and you missed it. And a month from now, you can't go back and listen to it because the news will be old and dated. I specifically don't do that type of thing. And it's no knock to those that do. It's just, it doesn't work for me. But you have to figure out what you're going to talk about and with whom you will talk about it. And what I mean by with whom is that you have to figure out is, are you going to have guest hosts? And if you do, how often will you have guest hosts? Will you have a permanent guest host, or will you, randomly have different hosts from time to time? So it just really just depends on, what you want to talk about. I think what I found is that people will if people feel engaged and feel, encouraged by what it is you're saying, you're not boring them to death. They'll tune in. How long they tune in, I'm not sure. It depends on what you do to keep them locked in. But if you're talking about current events, if you're talking about whatever happened yesterday on Twitter, I think generally speaking, you can keep people engaged and involved, particularly if you're entertaining or if you have a little comedy. That helps as well. So you really have to decide that and just kind of figure out how that fits to your personality. Now, the biggest question people always ask is, when you start making a podcast, well, what do you need? Basically, you need a microphone and a computer. Duh. I know that's what you're saying. But beyond that, it just really depends on how intricate you want to be. You can have, the dopest microphone that costs $400, or you can have just a pretty much basic microphone that costs $50. It just depends. Your computer can be your desktop or your laptop or whatever the case may be, or it can be a, iPad, whatever that you need to do to connect to wherever you need to connect to. The biggest thing is when you're starting a podcast is figuring out where you're going to launch it from. Are you going to launch it from a website? Or are you going to launch it from a streaming site? Like Anchor or what's another one? SoundCloud or iTunes. You have to figure out where you're going to launch it from. But other than that, once you figure those things out, it's pretty easy. And I tell people all the time, and I'll share this with you, do not be afraid to use Google. Google truly is your friend. When I was setting up this podcast, I didn't have any help. I didn't know what I was doing, but I just kept Googling things, how to upload a podcast to iTunes. I remember typing that up, and one of the things like in particular about iTunes was that you had to, before you could upload the podcast, you had to have your cover art, if you will, for your podcast. So my cover art for my podcast is a backdrop of the city of Atlanta from the Jackson Street Bridge. And so for me to do that, it has to be a certain size, and Apple will not accept it if it's not the exact right dimensions. But I didn't realize that. I just thought, okay, well, hey, I just upload it and that's it. But it's not as simple as that. But it's not tedious, but it's certain steps that you have to go through depending on whichever sites that you want to use. But it's not hard either. Again, Google is your friend. And the next thing you want to do is, just figure out which platforms where you want to have your podcast. I would suggest putting your podcast on every possible site that you can, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Google Play, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Overcast, Castbox, Player FM, iHeartRadio. My podcast is on every one that I just named. Just recently got on iHeartRadio. I don't even know how it was on iHeartRadio because I never submitted to put it on iHeartRadio, but it's there. And then you also want to promote and let people know that, hey, this is where I am. And so that's very important that you put it on as many platforms as you can, because people will listen and gravitate from that. Now, of course, for some, it's easier for them to hear it on one particular site than it is others, because, again, like I have Spotify, the podcast is on Spotify, but everybody doesn't listen to podcasts on Spotify. So when I'm promoting, I do promote Spotify, but I also, I can't just promote just that, because I don't want to shut out my audience. I want everybody to have the maximum opportunity to hear what it is I have to say on each podcast. A couple of do's and don'ts that you have to keep in mind as you're moving forward once you get the podcast up and running. Don't be afraid to talk. I know that sounds crazy, but some people, really get nervous and apprehensive about speaking into a microphone, knowing that people outside of their friends and family will hear it. I love to talk. As you could tell, what you may not know is I'm extremely shy and quiet. But seriously, I love to talk. So talking is not a problem for me, but don't be afraid to talk. One thing you should do, and I would recommend this, do collaborate with other podcasters if you can. I think that's it's always good to blend, energy and synergy with other podcasters, particularly people that you like and people that like you and listen to your podcast and you listen to theirs that you kind of vibe with. If you've been following this podcast, I will have on people here from time to time, other fellow podcasters, and I've got more coming that I vibe with, and I love having them on my podcast. And there's a couple of people out there that listen that I haven't had them on the podcast yet, but I will going forward, just because, I kick it with them like that. Don't be afraid to promote your podcast. I was telling someone once before that when you promote your podcast, also don't be upset if people close to you don't hear it. And I'll give you an example. Like one of my biggest fans is my dad, right? If you know me, you know my dad. My dad is, he loves me to death. I'm his son. I'm his oldest child. But I don't really, as much as my dad supports me, I don't expect my dad to to listen to the podcast and listen to me talking about why Jay-Z fell off. So, he's 73 years old. He's not listening to why Jay-Z fell off, but the people close to you may not hear it or may not get it. And to be honest, sometimes people close to you may or may not have the time nor capacity to listen to podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm in traffic, when I'm at work, because I'm not bothered. I don't have to talk to anybody at work. I work independently, so I'm just in my office, just chilling, and I don't have to, I as long as I'm not interrupted, I'm cool. But everybody doesn't have that type of time nor space where they can, listen. So, don't be upset if, the people close to you don't get a chance to hear your podcast. But yeah, don't be afraid to promote your podcast, especially if you feel like you got some good shit. If you feel like your podcast is dope, and which you should, don't be afraid to promote it. Let people know. And you don't necessarily, and sometimes I know you probably could feel like, okay, well, I don't want to be bothering people, but you're really not bothering people. You're just letting folks know, hey, I'm out here. One thing that you should do, be patient. Rome wasn't built in a day. To build up your audience is going to take time, and you have time. I mentioned earlier about the podcasters that I saw who kind of fell off because they weren't necessarily getting the numbers or the listens that they thought that they should initially. Again, Rome wasn't built in a day. I had quote unquote base, if you will, because a lot of people who listen to the radio show that I used to have would come and listen to the podcast. And then I picked up more people along the way, through social media and things of that nature. And to be honest, I really other than a handful of people, I really don't know who's going to listen week in and week out. But I'm not sitting around worrying about who's listening, who's not. I know that I'll put it out there and people will listen, but who's actually listening, I don't know. But be patient. Rome wasn't built in a day. What's another thing? Oh, please, for the love of God, if you have guests, don't talk over your guests. Let your guests talk. Man, I was listening to T.I.'s podcast, and T.I.'s new to the podcast game. And, I like T.I. T.I. represents the city that I live in, that we both live in, Atlanta. Love T.I., man. Good dude. And, I wanted to hear what he had to say, but I mean, he just kept talking. Like, he would ask his guest a question, and he would just, as soon as they started talking, he'd almost answer the question for them or cut them off. Allow your guests a chance to speak, because more often than not, the people tuned in to hear your guests talk, not you. Do understand that it's not necessarily about the numbers. I mean, numbers will come again. Now, if you're looking to create a podcast and have this podcast take off and blow up and you quit your job, I don't want to tell you that it can't happen, because it can, but understand that it's just not about the numbers. Because if you're strictly about the numbers, at some point in time, your listening public will hear that, and it comes off as, I don't know, desperate maybe. Also, don't assume, particularly when you're recording and you're talking to people, don't assume that people know who you are. Or, don't assume that people know who your guests are, even if you have a guest on frequently. I have guests on all the time. And like, when I have my guests on, I make sure that I introduce who they are. There's nothing worse than tuning into a podcast and you hear 4 people talking and you don't know who the people are that's talking. There's somebody new listening each time. So yeah, from time to time, you'll hear me do a reset saying, hey, this is 12 Kyle. I'm married, kids, live in Atlanta, graduate of South Carolina State University. And that's stuff that people who've been listening since day one, they already know. But a lot of times that's for the people who don't know, who may be tuning in for the first time. So you can't assume that people just know. One thing that you should do is be creative. Don't ever force your creativity. There's been times myself, and I'll speak on this. There's been times where I just either recorded something, or maybe the topic I didn't think was to my liking, whatever. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, I should record this. And then I start recording, and then I just stop during the recording because it feels like I'm forcing it. You don't ever want to force your creativity. Be yourself, be calm, be cool, and just put out dope stuff, man. But if you feel like you're recording something and it just doesn't feel good as you're talking about it, or you don't feel like you're as informed as you should be, stop recording. Don't force your creativity. And the last thing you should not do, don't make podcasting a job when it's not. Now, if this is your 9 to 5 and this is something that you're doing that is bringing in the money, that's different. But one of the quickest ways that you can resent your podcast is by making it like you're putting in so much work for it that you feel like almost indebted to it. Like if you work a regular 9 to 5 and then you come home and you're spending, 5-6 hours on the podcast, that can be tiresome. So, and I'm not saying that that there's a set amount of time that you should use for your podcast, because time factors differently. I'm able to record, on the weekends. I'm able to record at night, once family goes to sleep. Sometimes I try not to interrupt my family's time, but also when I'm having co-host on, I try to schedule my interviews out because I'm very respectful of other people's time as well. So but you don't want to make it a job. You don't want to make it feel like, oh, here I gotta go record this podcast. When it feels like that, it's time to stop. It's just, it's not good for you, and it's not good for your mental health either. But, yeah, that's about it. Keep these things in mind. And, if you're ever thinking about, starting a podcast, I think I've pretty much laid out the blueprint on how you should do it. The rest really is up to you. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for me. Thanks again for checking out the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I'm your boy 12 Kyle. I'll catch you guys next time. 5,000.